Plantation records from northeastern Alabama hold an entry dated March 1856 that resists easy explanation. 12 men, armed, practiced, and authorized by law, could not compel a single body to obey. The incident report, buried for a century in a county archive, describes wounds that doctors of the era called impossible. An aftermath so disruptive 3 overseers resigned within days, 2 never again speaking of what they had seen. The owner sealed papers and paid hush money to families. It would be convenient to call what happened supernatural. It is not. What unfolded on the Harrington estate that spring morning was more terrible because it was human. A revelation about capacity and choice that threatened the fragile foundations of Southern authority. Harrington Plantation occupied 3,000 acres, where the Tallapoosa River braided through red clay and low hills of oak and pine. Founded in 1821 by Colonel Marcus Harrington, a veteran of the Creek War, it had matured into one of Madison County's great cotton enterprises. By 1856, it supported 240 enslaved people, turned out 1,500 bales a year, and employed 17 white overseers, an unusually high number attributed to the colonel's exacting bureaucratic mind. The mansion watched from a rise. Greek Revival columns, galleries on 3 sides, 16 rooms presenting a proper face to any visitor. The true engine of the place, however, lived in the quarters. 2 long rows of cabins, the gin and mill, the smokehouse, the disciplinary systems that made everything run like a ledger. Colonel Harrington kept life by numbers. Every bushel, every hour, every punishment was recorded with a meticulous cruelty. Into that spreadsheet of property and productivity came Jacob Terrell in the autumn of 1852. Auction records from Richmond list the purchase price, $2,000, an amount nearly triple the usual sum. The catalog described a man of exceptional size, around 28 years old, 6 feet 7 inches tall, 260 pounds, a constitution suited to heavy labor, with a work history in iron foundries and timber, not the fields. Those papers omit what mattered most. Jacob had been forged in industry, not agriculture. Born in the Shenandoah Valley on an iron plantation, he had worked furnaces from 12, building compact, dense strength rather than the lean endurance of a field hand. His previous owner, a furnace master named Hiram Lell, sold him because Virginia's iron panic of 1851 forced liquidations, not for misconduct. Harrington bought Jacob for the hardest tasks: clearing land, turning the cotton press, operating the heaviest gear. For nearly 4 years, he did them without incident. He spoke little, labored efficiently, drew no special attention beyond his size. Then, in the winter of 1855, something shifted. Martha Clemens, the head cook and one of the few enslaved people permitted near the main house, later told her granddaughter in a 1937 WPA interview that Jacob had received a letter that autumn, an impossibility under plantation mail rules, yet the paper somehow reached him. Martha remembered Jacob standing motionless behind the cookhouse one October evening, a scrap of paper in his hands, his face hollowed as if he had glimpsed his own death. After that, his behavior changed in small, unsettling ways. He continued efficient work, but overseers noted a mechanical precision to his compliance, as if he were counting down. Thomas Gibbard, the head overseer, wrote in his log that Jacob began asking odd questions about property lines, river depths, and distances to neighboring counties. Practical, unthreatening curiosities that nonetheless raised a watchful eyebrow. Among the enslaved community, he drew mixed responses. Some avoided him, others clustered near him in the evenings, seeking the quiet steadiness that seemed to emanate from him. Old Samuel, who had been at Harrington the longest, likened Jacob to the stillness before a storm, the charged silence before the sky turns green and a tornado arrives. Colonel Harrington, in the months before his daughter Caroline's March wedding, was preoccupied with preparations that would display the plantation's wealth. He ordered an expansion of the cotton press operation in February 1856. Jacob was placed in charge of the team clearing land and installing the new press, working under 3 overseers: Gibbard, a Kentuckian named Eli Strauss, and a Georgian named William Pritchard. The work ran through February and into March with the rhythm of routine until the morning of March 14th. Dawn arrived wrapped in Tallapoosa fog that morning. The bell rang at 5:30 as it always did. Breath hung white in the cold air. The crew assembled by the press. Jacob reported for duty, preparing timber for the foundation. Gibbard, Strauss, and Pritchard were present, belts heavy with coiled leather straps and wooden bats. Gibbard wore a pistol where everyone could see it. Accounts differ on the spark. Gibbard later reported that Jacob openly refused an order to move a beam. Strauss claimed Jacob spoke disrespectfully when corrected for slow work. Martha Clemens, fetching water, said she heard Gibbard announce that a letter had been intercepted and its sender dealt with according to law, and that Jacob needed to learn the consequences of unauthorized correspondence. Whatever the precise trigger, the confrontation escalated until witnesses were standing, and the colonel's disturbances were no longer private. Gibbard approached with the leather strap. Jacob did not flinch. He remained standing, staring toward the river, though the fog kept it hidden. Gibbard struck him. Jacob did not react. Strauss moved in and grabbed Jacob's arm. What followed is the detail that recurs with eerie consistency across testimonies. Strauss felt as if he had seized a timber post. Jacob did not pull away. He did not resist in the ordinary way. When Pritchard joined, the 3 men struggled not against a person, but against something stubborn and immovable. Gibbard fired his pistol into the air and called for help. In minutes, an extraordinary concentration of authority assembled. 12 overseers, the largest gathering many of the enslaved had ever seen. They moved together, intent on demonstrating what plantation power meant. What they found instead was a refusal that made force seem brittle. They tried standard takedown techniques: leverage, joint manipulation, overwhelming force. Jacob did not strike, did not shove, did not flee. He simply would not be toppled. Witnesses would later describe it as watching men try to fell a tree that had decided to stay upright. Arms would grip and slip, knees would fail to buckle, balance simply did not break. The fog burned away. The clearing filled with people who watched, stunned. Then the sounds came, not the expected shouts and the sounds of a single body taking the blows, but thuds and groans coming from the overseers themselves. Men fell with dislocations and broken ribs, heads split, jaws shattered. The violence recorded in the reports did not belong to the man at the center of the circle. When Colonel Harrington arrived, 4 overseers lay injured. The rest had drawn back. Jacob stood in the middle of the cleared patch, breathing hard, unmoved by the injuries around him. He had not thrown a single blow. There was a long silence. In that pause, 2 men looked at one another across something deeper than the clearing. One whose order had been refused, and one who refused to be ordered. Jacob's voice, when he spoke, carried. "I ain't here no more," he said. "You might be looking at me, but I ain't here. I've been gone since that letter came." Without hurry, without flight, he turned and walked toward the tree line, The colonel shouted for men to stop him. No one moved to touch him. By the time anyone reached the woods, Jacob Terrell had vanished. The morning, which had begun like any other among the rows of young cotton and the stacks of timber, now contained an unnerving absence. 12 armed men had failed to restrain one unarmed man who walked away. The immediate hours after Jacob's departure unraveled into a kind of panic that felt almost theatrical in its ferocity. Colonel Harrington ordered the plantation locked down. No one was to leave their quarters or workstations. Riders were sent to neighboring estates bearing descriptions and warnings. The sheriff was notified. Within the day, 23 men, accompanied by bloodhounds borrowed from a plantation 15 miles south, scoured the timber and creek bottoms. The dogs picked up Jacob's scent from the press area without trouble and followed it into the woods for half a mile. Then, inexplicably, the trail stopped at a creek. Water often confuses trackers. Currents, puddles, and wind can scatter scent. What confounded the men who had spent their lives reading land was that the trail did not resume on either bank. They searched upstream and downstream for miles. Nothing. It was as if the scent vanished into the water itself. Search parties combed every ravine, every hollow, every ruin and creekside thicket for 11 days. They questioned enslaved people on neighboring properties, proffered rewards, and watched roads and river crossings for signs of movement toward freedom. The plantation's own people, those who had seen the clearing, maintained a stubborn silence when officials interrogated them. But among themselves they spoke endlessly. Some hoped Jacob had reached Georgia and his wife. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had walked into the woods to die by his own hand. Rumors traveled faster than the men riding out with pistols. Colonel Harrington tried to contain the facts, but the truth, once observed, resists being buried. He filed a sparse official report that named Jacob as escaped property and offered the usual reward, omitting the details that made the incident unmanageable. Privately, however, he began his own investigation. He questioned everyone who had known Jacob, re-examined purchase papers and logs. In the custody records, he found the clue that would wrench open his world further: a mail log showing an intercepted letter addressed to Jacob in February. The routine procedure had been to confiscate and destroy such correspondence, but the log revealed that one overseer, Henry Wallace, had delayed turning the letter in. In that interval, he had shown it to others. One of them, the colonel learned, had likely let Jacob know something of its contents. Wallace, gone from Harrington and employed at a Huntsville textile mill, admitted to the colonel that the letter came from a woman in Georgia identifying herself as Jacob's wife. The letter, Wallace said, was brief and devastating. She had been sold south after her owner's death. She was pregnant. She urged Jacob not to attempt a rescue because of the risks to her and the child. And then, in a last line Wallace could not forget, she wrote, "Don't let them take you piece by piece. Whatever they do to the body don't matter if you keep yourself whole inside. Remember me. Remember we real." The line haunted men who read it. For Wallace, it had been a revelation that kept him awake. The moral difficulty of owning a man who loved someone else. When the colonel read that scrap of sentiment, the March confrontation reframed itself. Jacob's sudden inability to be compelled looked less like physical anomaly and more like a chosen severance. If a man decided the body no longer mattered, if he willingly, absolutely, withdrew his investment in survival under a regime that traded in personhood, coercion would have no purchase. In private, Harrington admitted to himself the thought he could not allow to spread, that obedience was, fundamentally, a choice. Then came the bundle. In April, a plantation hand found a small cloth wrapped and shoved into the hollow of an oak near the northeastern boundary, about 30 yards from where the scent died. Inside, a crude wooden carving of two figures holding hands, a scrap of paper with an address in Georgia, and a metal tag like those worn by foundry workers. Tied to these objects was a torn piece of the intercepted letter. Scrawled across it, in a crude hand that plantation clerks later matched to Jacob's mark, was a short note. "I ain't running. I'm walking slow and steady. I'm going to Georgia. Probably take me 4 months if I move careful. If I make it, you won't never hear of me again. If I don't make it, at least I died trying to get back to what matters." That morning at the press, I wasn't fighting nobody. I was just showing y'all that I ain't a thing you can move around no more. I'm a man deciding where he goes. You can kill a man like that, but you can't work him. Colonel Harrington burned the note and the bundle. He had the words reduced to ash in the privacy of a tool shed, but ashes travel by other means. The message spread through whispers anyway. For the enslaved people who had seen Jacob stand and then walk away, the note confirmed what they'd always suspected deep down, that the center of the plantation's power was not in the whip nor in armament, but in the willingness of people to keep going along. Faced with that realization, Harrington made a practical choice. He formally closed the active manhunt after 2 months, citing expense and diminishing chances. Privately, he admitted he hoped Jacob had died. The alternative, that a man could move through hostile territory 350 miles toward Georgia and succeed, suggested that systematic control was more brittle than he'd believed. That suggestion terrified him. The panic his fear produced did more damage than the escape itself. Over the next months, a string of disappearances and odd behaviors unsettled the plantation. 2 people escaped in April. 3 more vanished in June. None were recaptured. The patterns were unnerving because they were unusually complete. No bodies, no trails, nothing recovered. Thomas Gibbard, the overseer who had first tried to move Jacob, watched these events and felt the logic harden. Men who had seen March 14th had internalized a different possibility. Tensions mounted until Colonel Harrington ordered a humiliating punishment meant to terrify and restore authority. He selected Daniel Hayes, a man believed to be linked to some of those who had slipped away, and scheduled 30 lashes in front of the quarters. The morning of July 28th, the plantation gathered. Overseers, field hands, the colonel's household staff. The lash was lifted. The crowd waited for the sound of leather on flesh, and then something happened no one anticipated. One person stepped forward to block the overseer, then another, then a dozen. Within half a minute, more than 50 people had formed a quiet line between Daniel and the man with the whip. They spoke no threats, raised no weapons. They simply stood. The overseer looked to the colonel for direction. The colonel ordered dispersal. No one moved. For 5 long minutes, the silence became a kind of pressure, a force as effective as a line of bayonets. Then someone began to hum a work song. Others joined in softly. The tune steadied the stand. The colonel relented. The punishment was postponed. That day changed the calculus. It made visible the exact mechanism Jacob had demonstrated. Unified, passive refusal. If 50 people could block a lawful punishment simply by standing together, the risks of enforcement escalated into the realm of mass violence the colonel feared might spiral beyond control. Resignations followed. Overseers who had once administered discipline with certainty now questioned the ground under their feet. Patrick Doyle, who left in October, wrote that he could not be present when the plantation's foundations cracked. Harrington responded in the only way he knew how: scatter and suppress. In November, he sold 75 people, nearly a third of his workforce, to plantations across 3 states. He claimed market reasons. Everyone understood the motive. He separated families, broke friendships, sent people far away in the hope of severing the memory and dispersing the witnesses. It was a cruel calculation, surgical in its cruelty. He believed distance would muffle the story. It did not. Stories travel by human means. Those sold carried the memory and its lesson from one plantation to the next. In the months that followed, Harrington's measures only heightened the atmosphere of watchfulness and quiet resistance. Some people retreated into self-preservation. Others refined methods of clandestine communication, coded songs, messages stitched into hymns, errands that traced patterns only insiders could read. The colonel's seizures of control, more locks, more patrols, more informants given small privileges, produced fractures rather than seals. The system he invested in could not be made impermeable simply by rearranging its cages. The kernel of Jacob's moment had slipped like a seed into the wider soil of bondage, and where it found purchase, it began to change the way people measured the possible. The winter that followed, 1857 into 1858, fell over northern Alabama with an uncharacteristic severity. Ice formed thick on the Tennessee River, thick enough that locals walked across it as if it were a frozen road. At Harrington Plantation, the cold seemed to sharpen every existing fracture. A reduced, scattered workforce moved through routines in silence. Fear had been replaced by something colder, thinner, distrust, exhaustion, and a vigilance that came as much from within the quarters as from the overseers who paced their nightly patrols. Colonel Harrington aged in months what should have taken years. His daughter Caroline, visiting for Christmas, wrote that her father seemed like a man listening continuously for a sound only he could hear. He jumped at doors closing, reread patrol logs in the middle of the night, and spoke of vigilance as though the enemy lived beneath the floorboards. He looked, she said, like a general who had survived a battle he did not understand. What she could not know was that letters had begun arriving from far beyond Alabama. Plantation owners in Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, men Harrington had never met, wrote requesting details about the incident with the large man who could not be restrained. The story he had tried to smother had grown hydra heads. It had not only spread through enslaved communities, but crossed into the correspondence of planters unsettled by murmurs of resistance they could not attribute to any single cause. In early 1858, a stranger appeared at Harrington's door. A Kentucky lawyer named Ambrose Stillwater, stiff in posture and expression, carrying a leather satchel as if it were something alive. He requested a private audience. Behind the closed door of Harrington's study, Stillwater explained that his client, whose identity he would not disclose, wished to purchase any information concerning Jacob. Background, temperament, physical capacity, and especially the circumstances of March 14th. The client offered $500, an absurd sum for second-hand knowledge of a man who, legally, was still considered property but practically unreachable. When Harrington demanded to know why anyone would pay so much for such information, Stillwater's answer was measured. "My client," he said, "is interested in the limits of human capability under extreme psychological pressure." The phrasing chilled the colonel enough that he dismissed the man outright. Stillwater left without protest, but placed a packet on the desk as he departed. For the colonel's clarity, he said, Inside were incident reports compiled from 8 plantations across 4 states, all spanning the months after March 1856. Work stoppages, mass refusals of punishment, groups standing in silent formation until overseers backed down, coordinated escapes under new moons. In each case, investigators traced the spark back to people who had once lived or labored at Harrington, or who had learned the story from someone who had. One report stood out. Mississippi, late 1857, 23 people stopping mid-row during cotton harvest, forming a near-perfect circle when the overseer approached with a whip. They stood together for 6 hours until the owner conceded changes to work conditions. 6 of those 23 had been purchased from Harrington Plantation during its liquidation of assets. They had carried the story with them, not in words alone, but in posture, in presence, in the quiet steadiness of people who had seen a man refuse to be moved. For Harrington, the packet was a revelation and an indictment. Jacob had not simply escaped. He had demonstrated a principle so stark that people who witnessed it could no longer unsee the mechanisms of their own oppression. The colonel realized, with a dread that felt like a physical ache, that the entire system he lived inside had always depended on consent. On coerced consent, yes, but still a form of choosing. When people believed they had no other choice, the system held. Once someone revealed, visibly, undeniably, that choice remained possible even under crushing force, the architecture cracked. In April 1858, Harrington made a decision that astonished his neighbors. He announced the sale of Harrington Plantation. The official reason was age and fatigue. The truth was simpler. He no longer believed he could hold the place together. He had lost faith not only in his authority, but in the fiction that authority itself was stable. By September, new owners from Mobile occupied the estate. Within 2 years, they would sell it again, then again, as discipline proved impossible to maintain among people who had heard whispers of the man who 12 overseers could not move. As for Jacob, the historical record becomes frayed after his disappearance. But in the summer of 1860, a small abolitionist newspaper in Philadelphia published an anonymous account from J.S., formerly of Virginia and Alabama, describing a 350-mile escape, a reunion with a wife sold south, and the birth of a son. Within that account lay a passage that echoed too precisely to ignore. I discovered that day that true resistance isn't violence or flight. It's the simple, absolute insistence on your own human dignity in circumstances designed to strip that dignity away. I didn't fight those men. I just decided they couldn't decide for me anymore. Whether J.S. was Jacob cannot be proven, but the shape of the experience, the cadence of the memory, aligns with eerie perfection. After 1860, the trail vanishes. A man who succeeds in rebuilding his life in the North often disappears from official record by necessity. Fugitive hunters, wartime dangers, fractured documentation make ghosts of the living. Or perhaps the disappearance speaks of a darker end. The truth will not surface. But historically, Jacob's ultimate fate matters less than what happened on that cold March morning. His refusal, silent, deliberate, devastating, pulled back the veil on the plantation's most fragile truth. Power that depends on submission is never absolute. All it takes is one person willing to pay the price for saying no. The Civil War would erupt 3 years later over 1,000 layered tensions. Yet beneath them all lay the same question Jacob illuminated in his quiet stand. Could a system built upon the denial of humanity survive its subjects' insistence on their own? The war answered for the nation what Jacob had answered for a single plantation. Colonel Harrington lived to see the Confederacy fall. In his later letters, he wrote of guilt that gnawed like a sickness, confessing that individual kindness meant nothing within a system that required cruelty to function. "The man Terrell taught me," he wrote in 1869, "not through threat or fist, but through a stillness I could not break." Harrington Plantation passed through multiple hands before being divided into small farms. The trees grew over the place where Jacob stood. The earth thickened and softened. No marker remains. But the story endured, carried in songs, in recollections, in the WPA interviews of the 1930s, where elderly men and women recalled hearing as children about the man no 12 white men could bend. Martha Clemens, who lived long enough to tell her granddaughter, put it most simply. "Jacob showed us we was choosing," she said, "even when the choices was all bad. And once you know that, you can't unknow it." Strength, physical or otherwise, was never the heart of the mystery. Jacob's resistance revealed something quieter, more unsettling, that the human will, once committed, can render established power structures suddenly, helplessly insufficient. And in that moment, in the clearing where fog had lifted and breath hung white, one man's refusal changed how hundreds understood themselves. If this story lingers with you, if Jacob's quiet stand unsettles or inspires, share it with someone who listens closely to the unfinished echoes of history. Subscribe for more forgotten truths buried beneath this country's darkest soil, and join us next time as we follow the shadows left behind by those who refused to be moved.